Hello, all of you out there, and welcome again to Peopling the Past, a podcast about real people and the ancient world. Every week, we chat with academics, professionals, and enthusiasts to bring you real stories and current research about the everyday folk who lived in antiquity. My name is Chelsea Gardner.
And I'm Melissa Funke.
You can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. Give us a rating and subscribe so that you never miss an episode. We're also on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Peopling the Past, and you can listen to our podcast and find other great content like videos and blogs on our website, peoplingthepast.com. If you like what we do, please share and tag us on social media with the hashtag PeoplingPodcast, and feel free to reach out anytime via direct message or email peoplingthepast@gmail.com if you have any questions, comments, or if there's a topic you'd like to hear us chat about. We always love to hear from you. And today we don't have an episode for you, but we are recording a promo for our upcoming 4th season, and we have a very special guest with us today, Christine Johnston, who is the video editor and producer for Peopling the Past and who played a very special role in this season. So, hi, Christy, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So, do you want to tell the listeners a little bit about what they can expect on this upcoming season, how it's a little bit different, and why you had the idea to go in this direction with the season?
So this podcast season is a little bit different, I guess, than some of the others. So we've had previous themes for each of the seasons we've had. And so I had proposed that we would do a podcast episode series on various aspects of cultural heritage related to the parts of the world we work in. So Europe, West Asia, and North Africa. And was really interested in producing some content and bringing on some specialists that work in a variety of aspects, from cultural heritage protection and community-based engagement on the ground, museums and holding practices, and the sort of history of looting and collections, as well as some of the broader aspects of colonialism and its impact and legacy in the fields that we work in.
Yeah, and we are recording this in December, but we started recording the episodes when, Melissa? January, February?
Last spring we started.
Yes. Yeah. I think, as a lot of people can understand, a lot of our specialists who work in cultural heritage have had a particularly difficult year in the areas of the world that we work in, have been watching a lot of cultural heritage destruction. So the taping of the season was delayed a little bit as we were accommodating different schedules for the different people that we wanted to participate. But I'm hoping that this means now we are ready, since everything is taped, to start launching episodes, releasing episodes in the new year.
And unfortunately, this topic doesn't get any less relevant with the current global political situation. So yeah, I think our listeners will find a lot to relate to with these topics.
We have people talking about community projects that are connected to some of their own heritage and communities. We have people talking about large-scale trade that's happening of antiquities around the world. So there really is just about every angle of what's happening with cultural heritage management covered. And I think this is our most international cast of guests so far.
And Christy did most of the legwork in finding all of these guests and wrangling them all. And so, Christy, maybe you want to say something about how you chose this assortment of wonderful guests?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I have done some research in cultural heritage, and especially the use of legacy collections in teaching and in different sort of community spaces. And so I really wanted the opportunity for some of the amazing scholars and cultural heritage specialists whose work I've used in some of my own and in my classroom to highlight the work that they were doing in their own communities. So that was a big kind of driving aspect of the selection process. And it really felt in many ways like my own version of like fantasy football or fantasy baseball, where like, created this list of some of the most sort of inspiring people that I've had the chance to learn from. And then they all said yes. And that was such an amazing aspect of this season. It was sort of the dream team version for academics, at least for me. So that was the driving force sort of behind the selection process. And of course, wanting to hear the voices of people from the communities that we're talking about and we're working in, and the work that they've done both within those communities and then especially with cultural heritage among both displaced communities and related to displaced objects.
Let's talk about some of the specific people that we've invited too. There's some really great scholars here. Again, people working in community. The list goes on and on and on. So maybe we can start with a friend of the project, Heba Abd El Gawad, who works on connecting Egyptian heritage to its source communities within modern Egypt, or Hardeep Dinsa, who is working on the colonial legacies of classics and who has completed his PhD since we talked to him as well.
And you know what, Christy, it's funny you mentioned your fantasy football roster. There were definitely episodes where Melissa and I were like fangirling out to actually speak to people. And I think Melissa Hardeep was one of them because you were talking about his stickers, right?
Yeah.
And I remember saying that to Alison Mickle, who was talking about her interviews with local field workers who are integral parts of archaeological field projects, but who are never brought to the forefront in her community archaeology. And I really, I felt like I was speaking to a celebrity. Like it was so fun.
It did feel a bit like that when emailing people to ask them to be a part of the podcast. It was very imposter syndrome-y, but everybody was so lovely and so willing to participate, which was amazing.
I'm always learning so much from every season, from talking to all of these specialists. I think one of my favorite episodes was the William Carruthers interview and learning about the idea of hydropolitics. How building dams, right, doesn't just affect archaeology, but it affects communities. And archaeology informs and inflects how those communities are affected by it. And that for me was very resonant as a Canadian, right, who lives in a province with dams and hydropolitics of its own.
I'm so glad you brought that up because I think that's one of the highlights of the collection of specialists we have is they deal with or work on all sorts of aspects of how archaeology has impacted communities, from early days of archaeology and really colonial extraction of cultural heritage to labor communities and knowledge production to the environment and the impact that we as archaeologists have often had in these different communities as we've prioritized, monumental cultural heritage related to aspects of our history we're interested in versus local communities and their needs and their connection to their own cultural spaces and their heritage. So I think I'm glad that was something that you took away. And that was actually going to be my main question was, as the person who had conceived of this season and had brought these sort of specialists together, for you two, what were the things that you found most impactful in getting to have these conversations as the podcast hosts?
Oh, I think one of the things I really enjoyed and really what I really got out of this was speaking to people who are actively working on issues that frequently come up in my classrooms, but now I have a conversation with somebody who is doing the work and putting the work in. And so, for example, you're talking about like communities, and community is such an important part of what we do, but communities aren't always source communities, and it's not always, overseas. It can be communities here in North America, people who visit museums. And I was thinking about Lisa Saladino-Haney and the work that she's doing at the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh, and how much work and thought and consideration and time and planning is going into this new exhibit to think about bridging past communities and present communities, right? Where these objects, and in some cases people, when we're talking about human remains, where they came from, but also where they reside now and how these communities interact with them. So that was incredible hearing somebody dealing with those issues. I remember also fangirling over Roberta Matza's work on the papyri and the forgeries, and that maybe because of, I don't know, maybe it was like very formative for me in like coming out of my graduate work and into the field. But this seemed like such a massive controversy, right, at the time, and all of these, the forgeries and the like lack of provenance and the illicit trade in antiquities and Hobby Lobby, and to hear from somebody who put so much time into this and really as like a passion project, like shifted her research away from what she regularly does into focusing on this like really pressing issue was so impressive to me. What about you, Melissa?
Well, absolutely the communities. And it's definitely affected for me this sort of small scale project that I run at U of W with our teaching collection of antiquities, and the way that we have thought about our community, again, the communities that we reach out to. And so inspired actually by our conversation with Lisa, with Heba, those two conversations in particular inspired me to reach out to our local Egyptian community. And we've done some work at a local festival, cultural festival, in, again, connecting that community to the Egyptian antiquities that are here in Winnipeg. And so for me, there was like an immediate impact. But what Chelsea was saying too, in the end of your comments there, was the urgency of this season. So sometimes when we work on the past, it can become a bit abstract. And that's what People in the Past is here to do, is to not let it be abstract, is to think about actual lives of actual people. And so the urgency of all of these episodes, I'm constantly reflecting on them. But there's actually one I was thinking of, Isber Sebrine, who joined us recently. And he is someone who works on the protection of cultural heritage in Syria. And so as we're recording this promo, just a few days ago, the Assad regime is no longer in Syria. And that world, is changing and shifting very dramatically. We can think about these things as museum objects, but they are never just objects. They have lives, they connect to communities. Communities are impacted by things like the antiquities trade, right? And that's also going back to our conversation with Katie Paul, who traces illicit antiquities trade using social media platforms. But all of these things are very urgent and very real.
I think the important thing is that cultural heritage is people-based. We're talking about human beings. We're talking about their lived communities. We're talking about the spaces they inhabit and the tangible and intangible heritage that shapes their lives. And so I think this is the most important thing as we're watching genocide, as we're watching violence, as we're watching destruction of cultural heritage on a massive scale, is to remember that first and foremost, these are human beings and that cultural heritage ties to people and communities.
I remember, I'm glad you mentioned Katie Paul's episode, Melissa, because I think, I don't have a favorite. I would never choose a favorite. But I think in terms of something that I've learned that has stuck with me the most was just how much she taught us about how global information is accessed and how it has been accessed. And I was really humbled because so much of what I have done in the past in my research is publicly accessible scholarship and globally available, with being totally ignorant to the fact that for a long period of time and for most of the world, Facebook was the internet. And I just was so clueless as to all of that information and how these massive corporations are just controlling access to information and the implications that has for antiquities looting and the antiquities trade. And it was just mind-blowing. I learned a lot this season. We always learn a lot from our guests.
And I will say, I mean, I learn again from every single season, every single episode. But this was a real sort of the scales falling from my eyes moment. And I always knew that there were these sort of illicit things happening, but I didn't perhaps appreciate the scale and the impact on people, on communities, on individuals.
And I like that you brought up the digital divide component of this, that we often talk a lot on our project about accessibility and open access. And there's a wonderful podcast, Access for Whom, which is a podcast on digital restitution that looks at African cultural heritage and what digitization and access actually mean. And so I think these issues of digital divides, who has access to broadband, linguistic colonialism in terms of who has access to the information in a language that they speak, as well as these questions of data sovereignty, that we take for granted this idea that open access is the ultimate goal and not really considering the needs of the descendant communities or the source communities that are tied to the cultural heritage that we might be working on. So I think all of these kind of topics were a goal of this podcast season, to bring this conversation into spaces in, Mediterranean studies, broadly construed, West Asia, North Africa, that don't tend to be as forefronted. When, you have textbooks you might assign for your class, there's not going to be substantial sections related to cultural heritage and data sovereignty and, holdings and legislation, whereas they may be much more forefronted in other disciplines and other fields related to anthropology and archaeology. So that, again, was another goal of this season, was to make some of these conversations sort of more available in a really comprehensive way.
It was really cool this semester when I was teaching my intro archaeology course, and there was a section in our cultural heritage and like the future of the past chapter on ethics and repatriation and rematriation and restitution. And it mentioned Dan Hicks in his book. And I was like, hey, class, guess what? We've got Dan Hicks on the upcoming season of the podcast, which was like, because the thing is, we often try to highlight voices that are not overly present in the, in traditional areas. But of course, we had some big hitting names this season, and Dan Hicks was one of them, and he was a delight. It was really, really great talking to him, but it was also a little bit surreal that we managed to schedule him in and actually talk to him about his work with the Benin bronzes, which was very cool.
Absolutely. And again, just rethinking the museum. And I think that's one thing that will be great about this whole season is that our listeners are going to be exposed to aspects of things like museum collections that they may not have ever considered, because we have so many people working on it from different angles. And then again, we also have people like Matra Umachandran, who thinks about the field of classics, right, in a challenging way, and challenges both its uses and its foundations. And that was a really excellent conversation, again, for me as someone who is a sort of a classicist, fits kind of neatly within that category. It's so good to, again, to always just interrogate the categories that we use and how they've come to be and how we use them. And so I do think our listeners, as they're listening to these episodes, there's going to be some moments where they're going to have to rethink some of the assumptions that they've made. But it's that healthy process of rethinking and questioning assumptions that I love, that our guests, none of our guests were shy about that at all.
A lot of our guests themselves, I think, had very interesting positionality in terms of where they fit in either within their disciplines or their own personal identities, nationalities, this sort of thing, which was really, really interesting. Melissa, you mentioned at the beginning that this was sort of our most global, even though it was still very, Eurocentric and North American. But folks like Zina Kamash, who we talked to about modern identity and her work in Iraq and straddling sort of these two places and these two spheres in which she inhabits and how to negotiate those complicated intersecting identities. And again, relates to what you were saying, Christy, about how this is all about people.
So for this very special season, Christy, we had some support. Could you tell us more about that?
Yes, absolutely. So this season was really generously supported by my institution, Western Washington University, with a social justice and equity grant. But the majority of the grant went, or almost all of it, went towards supporting two student RAs, Megan Ward and Abby Rains, who were wonderful, wonderful collaborators from the beginning of the season.
Yeah.
And I think we should highlight that there is going to be an accompanying series of blog posts. So there's going to be a whole variety of content that's related to all of these issues that we've just been discussing. So if you listen to the podcast, you're hungry for more, go to the blog.
And that is our episode. So thank you everyone for listening. And once again, you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Peopling the Past, our website, peoplingthepast.com, or email us at peoplingthepast@gmail.com. Thanks as always for listening, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.